The silver blade slid between his ribs as smoothly as butter through warm bread. Master Harrison Whitmore's eyes widened, his fork still halfway to his mouth, as 12-year-old Evelyn twisted the kitchen knife deeper into his chest. This is the story of how a child's desperate act of vengeance became legend whispered in quarters across the antebellum South. Charleston, South Carolina, August 15th, 1853. The humid air pressed against the Whitmore plantation like a fever dream, thick with jasmine and the distant clang of church bells echoing across the Ashley River. Sunday supper at Magnolia Grove was a sacred ritual: starched linens, polished silver, and the master's family gathered around mahogany that gleamed like spilled blood. Evelyn had been serving the Whitmores since she could barely reach the table. Born into bondage, she moved through their dining room like a shadow, refilling wine glasses and clearing plates, while conversations flowed around her as if she were invisible. Her mother, Sarah, worked in the kitchen below, her hands scarred from years of burns and cuts, her spirit broken by something far worse. The plantation records list Evelyn simply as girl, house servant, age 12, no last name. No mention of her intelligence, her quick wit, or the way she absorbed every conversation, every slight, every cruelty she witnessed. The ledger couldn't capture how she watched Master Whitmore's movements, studying the pattern of his footsteps late at night when he climbed the narrow stairs to the servants' quarters. Sarah never spoke of what happened during those visits, but Evelyn saw the bruises. She heard the muffled sounds through thin walls. She noticed how her mother's hands shook when preparing his meals, how she flinched whenever he entered the kitchen. That August evening, the Whitmore family had gathered for their weekly feast. Harrison sat at the head of the table, his wife Margaret to his right, their two sons discussing cotton prices and railroad investments. The conversation was ordinary, comfortable, the kind of casual dinner talk that wealthy families took for granted. Evelyn moved between the kitchen and dining room, carrying platters of roasted duck and sweet potato pudding. Each time she passed behind Master Whitmore's chair, her jaw tightened. Each time she saw him smile at his wife, laugh with his sons, play the role of devoted family man, something cold and sharp crystallized in her chest. What drives a 12-year-old to cross a line that can never be uncrossed? The kitchen knife had been sitting on the sideboard, recently sharpened for carving the evening's meat. As Evelyn reached for the serving spoon, her fingers closed around the wooden handle instead. But this moment, this split second of decision, was years in the making. To understand what happened next, we need to step back into the twisted relationship between master and slave that defined every breath Evelyn took from the day she was born. The knife felt surprisingly light in her small hand. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. And if this story grips you like it does me, hit that like button and subscribe, because what happens next will change everything you think you know about resistance, justice, and the price of silence. The screams from the servants' quarters stopped abruptly at 3:17 a.m. on a Tuesday night in July. Evelyn pressed her ear to the thin wooden wall, holding her breath until she heard her mother's footsteps shuffle back across the floor. The silence that followed such nights was always worse than the sounds that preceded them. Magnolia Grove operated on a carefully orchestrated system of cruelty disguised as Southern hospitality. The main house rose like a white temple against Spanish moss and live oak, its columns gleaming in daylight, while darker business unfolded in the shadows behind. Harrison Whitmore had inherited both the plantation and its methods from his father, a legacy of control maintained through strategic brutality and calculated kindness. The Whitmore family Bible, leather-bound and gold-leafed, sat prominently on the parlor table. Inside its front cover, Harrison had written his philosophy in careful script. A well-ordered household requires both firm discipline and paternal care. The slaves, he believed, were children who needed guidance. Sarah, Evelyn's mother, had received his particular brand of guidance for 6 years. Evelyn learned early to read the signs. When Master Whitmore's voice carried a certain edge during dinner conversations, when he dismissed the house servants earlier than usual, when he lingered in the hallway outside their quarters, she knew what would follow. Her mother would return the next morning with fresh bruises hidden beneath her sleeves, moving more slowly, speaking even less than usual. The other slaves understood without speaking. They'd developed an elaborate system of silent communication. A glance, a gesture, a way of arranging items in the kitchen that warned of danger. But silence had its limits. It protected them from immediate punishment, while allowing the deeper wounds to fester untreated. Charleston's elite society praised Harrison Whitmore as a model Christian gentleman. He attended St. World, Philip's Church every Sunday, donated generously to charitable causes, and hosted elegant parties where wives in silk gowns praised his kindness to his servants. Mrs. Margaret Whitmore often remarked to her friends how grateful the slaves seemed, how they smiled and sang while working. They never saw what Evelyn saw. A journal entry from Reverend Thomas Mitchell, dated July 30th, 1853, captures the prevailing attitude. Visited the Whitmore plantation today. The Negroes appear well-fed and content. Master Harrison demonstrates the proper Christian approach to managing his human property with both firmness and compassion. Behind closed doors, that compassion took a different shape. Sarah bore 3 children during her years at Magnolia Grove. 2 died in infancy, common enough that no one questioned their deaths. Evelyn survived, perhaps because she proved useful, perhaps because Harrison found her mother's grief more entertaining than her comfort. The children were never his family. Evelyn watched her mother shrink year by year, her spirit eroding like riverbank soil after a storm. Sarah had been 17 when she arrived at Magnolia Grove, sold from a plantation in Georgia after her previous owner's death. The bill of sale, preserved in Harrison's files, listed her as prime breeding stock, good temperament, excellent cook. By 1853, Sarah moved like a woman, twice her age. Her cooking remained impeccable. Her survival depended on it, but the light had drained from her eyes. She spoke to Evelyn in whispers, teaching her the skills needed to navigate their world. How to anticipate needs before they were voiced. How to become invisible when danger approached. How to endure what couldn't be avoided. But some lessons couldn't be taught with words. How do you explain to a 12-year-old why her mother cries silently while kneading bread? How do you prepare a child for a world where kindness and cruelty wear the same face, where protection comes with a price that slowly destroys everything worth protecting? Evelyn learned by watching, and what she saw carved itself into her memory with surgical precision. The pattern of bruises that appeared in 5-finger shapes, the way her mother's breath caught when footsteps approached their door, the sound of Harrison's voice shifting from public politeness to private command. And slowly, silently, something harder than hatred began growing in Evelyn's chest. Not the hot rage that burns bright and fades quickly, but the cold, patient fury that sharpens itself on every injustice, every ignored scream, every morning after silence. The kitchen knife wasn't chosen randomly that August evening. Evelyn had been watching it for weeks, studying how it caught the light, how it balanced in her small hands when she helped prepare meals. She'd imagined the moment so many times that when it finally arrived, her muscles moved with practiced certainty. But before we witness that moment of reckoning, we need to understand the elaborate web of denial that surrounded it and how an entire community chose blindness over truth. Death comes quietly to those who learn to listen. Charleston's church bells chimed 8 times that Sunday morning as carriages rolled down cobblestone streets toward houses of worship. In the Whitmore carriage, Harrison adjusted his cravat while Margaret fanned herself against the August heat, their sons discussing the previous evening's card game. The same community that praised Christian charity would soon demand a child's blood. St. Philip's Episcopal Church stood as Charleston's moral center, its steeple piercing the sky like a righteous finger pointing toward heaven. The congregation included the city's most prominent families: plantation owners, merchants, politicians, men who shaped laws, and women who shaped society's conscience. They gathered each Sunday to hear sermons about love, forgiveness, and the divine order that placed each soul in its proper station. That divine order, according to Reverend Mitchell's teachings, included slavery as part of God's plan. His sermons frequently reference biblical passages about servants obeying masters, about accepting one's earthly lot while awaiting heavenly reward. The congregation nodded approvingly, their consciences salved by Scripture that transformed cruelty into divine will. But divine order required careful maintenance. The Charleston slave codes, updated in 1851, contained 47 specific regulations governing every aspect of enslaved life. Slaves couldn't gather in groups larger than 7. They couldn't learn to read or write. They couldn't testify against white citizens in court. Most importantly, they couldn't raise their hands against their masters under any circumstances. The penalty was death. These laws weren't abstract legal concepts. They were insurance policies protecting a way of life built on systematized violence. Margaret Whitmore hosted weekly tea circles where Charleston's finest ladies discussed charitable works and social reforms. They organized clothing drives for poor white families, raised funds for a new orphanage, and debated the moral implications of the temperance movement. Their conversations, recorded in Margaret's detailed diary, reveal women genuinely concerned with righteousness and social improvement. They never discussed what happened in the quarters after dark. A letter from Margaret to her sister in Savannah, dated June 12, 1853, captures this willful blindness. Our servants seem particularly content this season. Sarah produces the most exquisite meals, and her daughter Evelyn shows remarkable aptitude for household management. Harrison maintains such excellent discipline among the Negroes, never harsh but firm when necessary. I believe we demonstrate the proper Christian approach to our responsibilities. The proper Christian approach included elaborate justifications for systematic abuse. Medical theories of the time, promoted by physicians like Dr. Samuel Cartwright, classified resistance as mental illness. Slaves who attempted escape suffered from drapetomania, the disease that made them flee captivity. Those who talked back exhibited dysesthesia aethiopica, a condition causing disrespect toward white authority. Under these theories, Evelyn's growing anger wasn't righteous indignation. It was pathology requiring treatment. Charleston's legal system reinforced these medical fantasies with brutal efficiency. The city's court records from 1850 to 1854 document hundreds of cases involving enslaved defendants. Not one resulted in acquittal when the victim was white. Punishments ranged from public whipping to branding to execution, depending on the severity of the crime and the judge's interpretation of necessary deterrence. Justice moved with mechanical precision when black hands touched white flesh. The mechanics of denial required active participation from every level of society. Neighbors who heard screams explained them away as discipline. Doctors who treated suspicious injuries diagnosed accidents. Ministers who counseled traumatized slaves prescribed prayer and submission. Each person's silence enabled the next person's blindness, creating a web of complicity that trapped victims while protecting perpetrators. Even slaves themselves participated in this system of denial. Though they had no choice, speaking truth meant death. So they developed coded languages, hidden networks, and elaborate performances of contentment. They smiled when expected to smile, sang when ordered to sing, and buried their rage so deeply that white observers could pretend it didn't exist. But Evelyn was 12 years old, and 12-year-olds haven't yet learned the full cost of truth-telling. The warning signs had been accumulating for months. Kitchen staff noticed her watching Harrison with unusual intensity. She asked questions about the schedule of household activities, about who would be present at Sunday supper, about the location of various utensils. Her mother, Sarah, grew increasingly nervous about these conversations, sensing danger in her daughter's curiosity. Other slaves tried subtle interventions. Old Ben, the stable master, assigned Evelyn extra chores on Sunday afternoons to keep her away from the main house. Celia, who supervised the laundry, suggested Sarah request permission to send Evelyn to work in the fields where she'd be further from the family's daily routines. None of them spoke directly about their concerns. Direct speech was too dangerous, and besides, how do you tell a child that her desire for justice will only result in her death? What would you do if you watched your mother suffer daily abuse, knowing that speaking up meant your own destruction? How long would you remain silent while witnessing systematic cruelty disguised as Christian duty? The Sunday that changed everything began like all the others, with church bells calling Charleston's elite to worship, while their property prepared the evening meal that would end in blood. The congregation sang hymns of mercy while sharpening knives in their kitchens. The crystal glasses caught afternoon light like captured rainbows as Evelyn set the final place setting. In 3 hours, those same glasses would be stained with blood spatter and the echo of screams. Understanding this moment requires witnessing how routine cruelty masqueraded as family tradition. The Whitmore dining room embodied antebellum elegance mahogany furniture imported from England, portraits of stern ancestors watching from gilded frames, and a chandelier that cast dancing shadows across walls papered in French silk. Every Sunday at 5 o'clock, the family gathered here for their weekly feast, a ritual that reinforced their position at the top of Charleston's social hierarchy. Evelyn had served at this table for 3 years, learning to anticipate every need before it was voiced. She knew that Harrison preferred his wine glass filled exactly halfway, that Margaret required her napkin folded in precise triangles, that the younger son Thomas always spilled gravy on his vest. These details had become second nature, allowing her to move through the room like an extension of the furniture itself. But today felt different. Today, her hands trembled as she polished the silver, and she found herself studying the placement of each utensil with unusual intensity. The menu for August 15th had been planned with typical Southern grandeur: roasted duck with cherry glaze, sweet potato pudding, fresh cornbread, and Margaret's famous peach cobbler. Sarah had spent the entire day in the kitchen, her movements mechanical and precise, despite the bruises still visible on her wrists from Harrison's latest nocturnal visit. Kitchen records from that day, preserved in Margaret's household ledger, note the exact timing of meal preparation: duck in oven at 1 o'clock, pudding mixed at 2:30, bread rising at 3:15. The precise scheduling reflected the choreographed perfection that wealthy families demanded from their enslaved labor. But timing would prove crucial for reasons Margaret never anticipated. The Whitmore sons arrived at 4:45. Their conversation focused on cotton futures and railroad investments. James, the elder at 23, had recently returned from a business trip to New York, full of stories about Northern attitudes toward slavery. Thomas, 19 and prone to dramatic gestures, dismissed his brother's concerns about growing abolitionist sentiment. "Let them preach all they want," Thomas declared, settling into his chair. "Our property is protected by law and custom. These people depend on us for everything: shelter, food, purpose. Remove that structure, and they'd be lost." Harrison nodded approvingly at his son's confidence. Precisely why firm guidance remains essential. Kindness without authority breeds chaos. Margaret adjusted her lace collar and smiled. The servants seem particularly devoted lately. Sarah's cooking has improved remarkably, and little Evelyn shows such promising development. We're blessed with their contentment. None of them noticed Evelyn standing motionless beside the sideboard, the serving spoon frozen in her grip. The conversation continued along familiar paths: complaints about crop yields, gossip about neighboring plantations, plans for the upcoming Charleston social season. They discussed their human property with the same casual authority they used to debate livestock purchases or furniture arrangements. Evelyn existed in their awareness only when they needed something refilled, cleared, or brought from the kitchen. This invisibility had protected her for years. Today, it would provide perfect camouflage. At 5:27 p.m., Sarah emerged from the kitchen, carrying the roasted duck on her grandmother's china platter, a piece that had somehow survived the journey from the Georgia plantation where she'd been born. Her hand shook slightly as she set it before Harrison, who barely acknowledged her presence with a grunt of approval. The family began eating with the relaxed pleasure of people accustomed to being served. Conversation flowed around topics both mundane and momentous. Margaret's plans for redecorating the parlor, James's observations about northern business practices, Thomas's romantic pursuit of the Caldwell girl from Beaufort. They ate human flesh prepared by hands that Harrison brutalized nightly, served by a child whose rage had been simmering for months, discussed by voices that never questioned the system that fed their comfort with others' suffering. The irony would have been perfect if it weren't so perfectly normal. Evelyn moved between kitchen and dining room with mechanical precision, refilling water glasses, removing empty plates, bringing fresh bread from the warming oven. Each trip took her past the sideboard, where the carving knife lay beside the serving utensils, its blade recently sharpened by the same hands that had prepared the evening's meal. At 6:15 p.m., Harrison called for dessert. Margaret's peach cobbler had been Sarah's masterpiece that evening. Golden crust perfectly browned, sweet peach filling still bubbling from the oven. The family praised it enthusiastically, their pleasure genuine and uncomplicated. They never wondered about the tears that had fallen into the batter while it was being mixed. As Evelyn cleared the dessert plates, Harrison leaned back in his chair with the satisfied expression of a man whose world operated exactly as he believed it should. His wife smiled warmly at their sons. The conversation turned to plans for next week's dinner party, which prominent families to invite, what delicacies Sarah might prepare to impress their guests. The clock in the hallway chimed 6:30 p.m., its measured tones marking time in a world about to shatter. How long can a 12-year-old watch her mother's spirit break before something inside her breaks as well? Evelyn's hand found the knife handle just as Harrison began telling a story about disciplining a field hand who'd been caught stealing corn, his voice carrying the casual authority of a man who'd never questioned his right to inflict suffering. The blade felt warm against her palm, as if it had been waiting for this moment as long as she had. Harrison Whitmore's laugh died mid-syllable as 8 inches of sharpened steel slid between his ribs. Time fractured into crystalline fragments, the clink of his wineglass hitting the floor, Margaret's intake of breath, the wet sound of metal piercing flesh. In that instant, 300 years of social order collapsed around a dining room table. The physics of the moment unfolded with terrible precision. Evelyn had approached from behind Harrison's chair, moving with the same invisible grace she'd perfected over years of service. Her right hand gripped the knife handle while her left steadied herself against his shoulder, a gesture that might have seemed affectionate to anyone not watching closely. The blade entered at the precise angle between his 4th and 5th ribs, angled upward toward the heart with surgical accuracy. Harrison's body went rigid, his hands gripping the table edge as his nervous system processed an impossibility. A child, his property, had violated the fundamental law that protected his existence. Margaret's scream shattered the dining room's genteel atmosphere like broken crystal. James lunged forward, his chair toppling backward, while Thomas sat frozen in shock. But Evelyn didn't run. She stood beside Harrison's chair, her small hand still gripping the knife handle, watching his face cycle through disbelief, rage, and finally, fear. For the first time in his life, Harrison Whitmore was powerless. Blood began seeping through his white linen shirt, spreading outward in a crimson stain that matched the wine pooling beneath his fallen glass. His breathing became shallow, labored, as his body fought against the damage she'd inflicted with such calculated precision. "You," he gasped, his voice barely audible. "You little." He never finished the sentence. The blade had found its mark. James reached them first, his hand shaking as he tried to assess his father's wound without disturbing the knife still protruding from his back. Medical training hadn't been part of his gentleman's education, but even he understood that removing the blade might cause more damage than leaving it embedded. "Get the doctor!" Margaret screamed at Thomas, who remained paralyzed in his chair. "Get Dr. Morrison! Ride to town! Now!" But Thomas couldn't move. He stared at Evelyn with an expression of complete incomprehension, as if she'd suddenly sprouted wings or burst into flames. The fundamental categories of his world master and slave, power and submission, white and black, had been violently rearranged, and his mind struggled to process the new reality. Evelyn released the knife handle and stepped backward, her movements calm and deliberate. She showed no remorse, no fear, no attempt to flee or hide. Instead, she stood watching Harrison struggle for breath with the same detached interest she'd learned from watching him brutalize her mother. "Why?" Margaret whispered, her voice breaking. "Why would you do this? We've been good to you. We've treated you like family." The question hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Sarah appeared in the doorway, drawn by the screams. When she saw the scene, Harrison slumped forward with a knife in his back. Evelyn standing beside him, covered in blood spatter. The White family in various states of shock and panic, her legs gave way. She knew her daughter had just signed both their death warrants. Charleston's slave codes were explicit about punishment for violent resistance. Section 12, subsection 4, stated that any slave who shall strike, wound, or bruise any white person would be sentenced to death by hanging. The code made no exceptions for age, no allowances for provocation, no consideration of circumstances. Justice was white, swift, and absolute. The sound of hoofbeats echoed from the front drive as Thomas finally spurred his horse toward town. Dr. Morrison lived 3 miles away if he could be found, if he agreed to come, if he arrived in time. But everyone in that dining room understood that Harrison's survival was less important than what would follow. Within hours, Charleston's legal machinery would begin grinding toward its inevitable conclusion. James attempted to comfort his mother while monitoring his father's weakening pulse. Harrison's eyes had lost focus, his breathing reduced to shallow gasps that rattled in his throat. The knife remained embedded in his back, its wooden handle rising and falling with each labored breath. Evelyn watched it all, with the same steady gaze she'd fixed on him during years of silent observation. She'd studied him, learned his patterns, waited for her moment. Now she was studying the consequences of her choice with equal intensity. "She's possessed," Margaret whispered to James. "Something evil has taken hold of her. No child could do this. No human child." The need to explain the inexplicable had already begun. Evelyn's action couldn't be understood as rational response to systematic abuse that would implicate the entire social structure. Instead, it had to be madness, possession, or some other force that absolved the system of responsibility for creating the conditions that made such desperate acts inevitable. But Evelyn wasn't possessed. She was 12 years old, and she'd had enough. How many nights of listening to her mother's muffled cries does it take to transform a child into an instrument of vengeance? Harrison Whitmore died at 7:43 p.m., his last breath escaping in a whisper that might have been her name. The knife remained in his back until Dr. Morrison arrived 2 hours later to officially pronounce what everyone already knew. The girl who'd served his family faithfully for 3 years had become the instrument of his judgment, and now Charleston would demand hers in return. The courthouse bell tolled 9 times that Monday morning, as Charleston's elite gathered to witness the swift dispensation of white man's justice. In the prisoner's dock sat a 12-year-old girl whose crime had shattered every assumption about power, property, and the natural order of things. The trial of Evelyn would last exactly 4 hours and 17 minutes. Judge Samuel Rutledge presided over Charleston's criminal court with the stern authority of a man who'd never questioned the system that elevated him to power. His courtroom occupied the second floor of the City Hall, its tall windows letting in morning light that illuminated oil paintings of founding fathers and distinguished jurists. The symbolism was deliberate white men, watching over proceedings that would determine the fate of those who challenged white authority. The prisoner's dock had been modified with wooden blocks to allow Evelyn to see over its walls. She sat motionless, her small hands folded in her lap, wearing the same blood-stained dress from Sunday evening. No one had offered her clean clothes. The visual impact was intentional. The jury needed to see exactly what a slave rebellion looked like. Prosecutor William Hayworth opened with righteous fury that echoed through the crowded courtroom. His voice carried the moral certainty of a man defending civilization itself against barbaric chaos. "Gentlemen of the jury," he began, "we gather today to address an act so heinous, so contrary to natural law, that it strikes at the very foundation of our society. This child, this property, has committed murder most foul against the Christian gentleman who provided her shelter, sustenance, and guidance." The prosecution's case required no complex arguments. The facts were undisputed. Evelyn had plunged a knife into Harrison Whitmore's chest during Sunday supper. Multiple witnesses had observed the act. The defendant showed no remorse, no signs of mental disturbance that might mitigate her guilt. More importantly, the law was explicit. South Carolina's slave codes left no room for judicial discretion when property attacked its owner. Court records from August 17th document the testimony with bureaucratic precision. Margaret Whitmore described the scene through tears, emphasizing her family's kindness toward their servants. James testified about his father's character as a benevolent master who'd never raised his voice in anger. Thomas provided details about the knife's trajectory and the defendant's calm demeanor following the attack. No one mentioned Sarah's bruises or Harrison's nocturnal visits to the quarters. The defense attorney, appointed by the court as required by law, made a perfunctory effort to argue temporary insanity. Thomas Melbourne was young, inexperienced, and clearly uncomfortable with his assignment. His opening statement lasted less than 10 minutes. "Gentlemen," he offered weakly, "we must consider that this child acted under some form of mental disturbance. No rational person would commit such an act against their benefactor. I ask only that you consider mercy in your deliberations." He called no witnesses. He presented no evidence of abuse or provocation. He made no attempt to challenge the prosecution's narrative of unprovoked violence against benevolent authority. The legal system wasn't designed to hear such evidence anyway. A Spectator's journal, kept by merchant Robert Caldwell, captures the courtroom atmosphere. The nigger girl showed no emotion throughout the proceedings. Most unsettling, she stared at the judge with the same insolence she must have fixed on poor Harrison before striking him down. Such creatures cannot be allowed to believe they might escape justice for their crimes. But justice in Charleston wore a white face and spoke with a Southern accent. The jury deliberated for 23 minutes. Their verdict surprised no one guilty of murder in the first degree. Judge Rutledge scheduled the execution for the following Friday at noon, allowing sufficient time for public notice and crowd assembly. Charleston's newspapers announced the hanging with headlines that emphasized the broader implications. "Swift justice preserves order, and proper response to slave violence demonstrates Southern resolve." The articles portrayed Evelyn's execution not as punishment for an individual crime, but as a necessary demonstration of white authority. The Charleston Mercury editorial, published Wednesday morning, captured prevailing sentiment. While we might feel natural sympathy for one so young, we must remember that mercy misplaced becomes cruelty to society. This child's crime demands the ultimate penalty, lest other property believe they might escape consequences for similar acts of rebellion. But sympathy was stirring in unexpected quarters. Wednesday evening, a crowd gathered outside the courthouse. Not the usual mob demanding vengeance, but something more complex. White abolitionists from the North had traveled to Charleston, drawn by reports of a child facing execution. Local slaves congregated despite laws prohibiting assembly, their presence quiet but unmistakable. Sheriff Marcus Webb increased security around the jail, where Evelyn awaited execution. Death threats had been received, but not all of them targeted the prisoner. Some threatened anyone who might attempt rescue. Others promised violence against officials who would hang a 12-year-old child. The machinery of justice had been set in motion, but something was grinding against its gears. What happens when a child's desperate act of resistance forces an entire community to confront the brutality they've chosen to ignore? Friday morning dawned clear and hot, with crowds already gathering in the town square where Charleston's gallows stood, ready to deliver its lesson about the price of defying white authority. But Evelyn would never make that final walk. The cell door swung open at 2:47 a.m. with barely a whisper of sound. In the darkness, Evelyn saw only shadows, figures, moving with practiced silence, hands reaching to guide her toward freedom she'd never dared imagine possible. Her rescue ignited a network that had been waiting generations for someone worth the risk. Charleston's jail occupied the basement of the courthouse, its thick stone walls designed to muffle screams and contain desperation. 5 cells lined a narrow corridor lit by a single oil lamp that cast dancing shadows against damp walls. The air reeked of human waste, fear, and the peculiar staleness that accumulated in places where hope came to die. Evelyn had spent 4 days in the corner cell, sitting on a straw mattress that crawled with insects, eating thin gruel served twice daily by guards who avoided looking at her directly. They'd seen condemned prisoners before, but never one so young, never one whose crime had shattered so many comfortable assumptions about the natural order. The rescue had been planned with military precision by people who'd spent decades perfecting the art of invisible resistance. Samuel Freeman, a free black carpenter, had studied the jail's routines for months. He knew that Guard Peterson dozed off around 2 a.m., that the night shift changed at 4, that the back entrance faced an alley where shadows provided perfect camouflage. More importantly, he understood that some risks were worth taking when a child's life hung in the balance. The network that spirited Evelyn away extended far beyond Charleston's boundaries. Free blacks, sympathetic whites, and escaped slaves had created an elaborate system of safe houses, coded messages, and carefully planned routes that could move human cargo from the deep south to northern cities, where freedom wasn't just a legal concept. But this rescue carried special significance. Evelyn hadn't simply escaped slavery, she'd struck back against it with deadly force. Her story was already spreading through slave quarters across the South, whispered in coded language that transformed a 12-year-old girl into something approaching legend. She'd done what adults could only dream of doing. She'd made her master bleed. She'd proved that the powerful weren't untouchable after all. The Underground Railroad had transported thousands of escaped slaves to freedom, but they'd never carried cargo quite like this. Sarah waited in a wagon hidden behind Freeman's carpentry shop, her face streaked with tears she'd been storing since Sunday evening. When Evelyn appeared in the doorway, mother and daughter embraced. Without words, there would be time for conversation later, time to process what had happened and what would follow. First, they had to disappear. The wagon rolled north through pine forests and tobacco fields, following routes carved by previous runaways who'd left subtle markers for those who followed. A notched tree here, a particular arrangement of stones there, symbols that meant safety to those who knew how to read them. Behind them, Charleston was waking to discover that justice had been thwarted by forces they'd never acknowledged existed. Sheriff Webb found the empty cell at dawn, along with a note written in careful script. The child has been claimed by those who understand that true justice doesn't always wear a white face. Look for her in the wind, in the whispers, in every slave who dares to dream of freedom. The escape triggered the largest manhunt in Charleston's history. Bloodhounds were brought from neighboring counties. Rewards were posted, offering substantial sums for Evelyn's recapture. Suspected collaborators were questioned with methods that violated even the loose standards of antebellum interrogation, but the network had anticipated such responses. By the time search parties organized, Evelyn and Sarah were already crossing into North Carolina, hidden in the false bottom of a merchant's wagon that carried legitimate goods alongside human contraband. The Charleston Mercury's coverage of the escape reveals the establishment's fury. This brazen rescue represents not merely the theft of property, but an assault on the foundations of civilized society. Those responsible for harboring this murderous child have declared war on law itself. But other voices began emerging as news of the escape spread beyond the South. Northern newspapers picked up the story with different emphasis. The Boston Liberator published a detailed account under the headline, "Child Warrior Escapes Southern Vengeance." Frederick Douglass wrote an editorial praising Evelyn's courage while condemning the system that had driven her to violence. Abolitionist speakers began including her story in their lectures, transforming a desperate act of self-defense into a symbol of resistance that resonated across racial lines. She became proof that the enslaved weren't passive victims waiting for white saviors, but active agents capable of striking back against their oppressors. The mythology was growing faster than the girl herself. What transforms a child's act of desperation into a legend that inspires others to risk everything for freedom? By autumn of 1853, reported sightings of Evelyn came from across the North, Philadelphia, New York, Boston, Detroit. Most were false, but each report added another layer to her growing legend. Some claimed she was organizing escaped slaves into armed resistance groups. Others insisted she'd been smuggled to Canada, where she was raising funds for slave rebellions. A few swore they'd seen her distributing weapons to plantation workers in Virginia. The truth was simultaneously simpler and more complex. She was learning to read in a Quaker schoolhouse in Pennsylvania, trying to process what she'd done and what it meant for the thousands still trapped in bondage. But legends don't require truth to change the world. The teaching primer trembled in Evelyn's hands as she sounded out words that would have meant death in Charleston. In a Pennsylvania Quaker schoolhouse, surrounded by children who'd never known bondage, she was learning that knowledge could be a different kind of weapon. But her story had already escaped her control, spreading like wildfire through a nation on the verge of tearing itself apart. The Friends Meeting House in Lancaster County stood as a monument to radical Christianity, the kind that preached human equality rather than divine hierarchy. Here, escaped slaves learned to read alongside the children of abolitionists, their presence a living testament to principles that much of America still considered dangerous sedition. Evelyn, now 13, had grown taller, but remained haunted by memories that no education could erase. She spoke little about Charleston, about Harrison Whitmore, about the night she'd chosen violence over submission. But her teachers noticed how she flinched at sudden movements, how she watched doorways with the wariness of someone who'd learned to anticipate danger. The Quakers asked no questions about her past. They simply offered what she'd never received before the chance to become something other than property. But Evelyn's legend had taken on a life independent of her actual existence. Across the South, slave quarters buzzed with stories of the girl who'd struck down her master and vanished into the night. Each telling embellished the details. She'd killed multiple white men, she'd burned down the plantation, she was organizing armies of escaped slaves, preparing to return south with weapons and righteous fury. These stories served purposes beyond entertainment. They gave hope to people trapped in hopeless circumstances, proof that the powerful weren't invincible, that resistance was possible even for those who seemed weakest. Frederick Douglass captured this psychological impact in an 1854 speech. Young Evelyn's blade pierced more than one man's heart. It punctured the myth of contented servitude, exposed the lie of benevolent mastery, and demonstrated that those who profit from cruelty must always fear the consequences of their crimes. But the backlash was equally powerful. Southern states tightened slave codes even further, imposed harsher penalties for any sign of resistance, and created elaborate surveillance networks designed to prevent similar acts of rebellion. The Charleston Mercury published weekly editorials demanding federal action to recapture the murderous fugitive, whose example threatens civilized society. Violence breeds violence, and Evelyn's story accelerated the spiral toward national catastrophe. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 brought slavery debates into Congress with renewed fury. Southern senators cited Evelyn's case as proof that slaves couldn't be safely freed. They were inherently violent, they argued, capable of unspeakable brutality against those who'd cared for them, like family. Northern abolitionists used the same story to argue the opposite, that slavery was so inherently brutal it drove even children to desperate violence. Both sides claimed her as evidence for their positions, neither particularly interested in what she might have wanted for herself. By 1855, reported Evelyn sightings stretched from Canada to Mexico. She'd supposedly been seen recruiting fighters in Kansas, organizing resistance cells in Virginia, even meeting with John Brown to plan coordinated uprisings across the South. Most reports were fantasy, but they revealed how desperately both sides needed her to be more than what she was: a traumatized child who'd struck back against her abuser. The real Evelyn continued her education in quiet obscurity, learning mathematics and literature, while her legend inspired others to acts of courage and desperation. She knew about the stories. Of course, newspaper clippings found their way to the Quaker school. Letters arrived from strangers seeking confirmation of various myths. She never responded to them. She was trying to build a life beyond the violence that had defined her childhood. But history had other plans. When John Brown launched his raid on Harper's Ferry in 1859, investigators found documents referencing the Charleston girl as inspiration for the attack. When South Carolina seceded in 1860, speakers at the convention cited her escape as evidence that Northern radicals would stop at nothing to destroy Southern civilization. When the first shots were fired at Fort Sumter, some claimed they could hear an echo of the night a 12-year-old girl chose death over submission. The Civil War that followed would claim over 600,000 lives, but it began with smaller acts of resistance. Slaves who ran away, masters who discovered their property, could think and plan and strike back when pushed beyond endurance. Evelyn never returned south. She married a carpenter in Philadelphia, raised 3 children, and died quietly in 1897, outliving the system she defied by more than 30 years. Her obituary in the Philadelphia Inquirer identified her simply as a former slave who became a teacher. It made no mention of Charleston, of Harrison Whitmore, or of the Sunday evening that changed American history. What would you do if you discovered that your moment of desperate courage had inspired a war that killed more Americans than any conflict before or since? But legends live longer than the people who inspire them. Even today, in Charleston's tourist district, guides tell sanitized stories about antebellum elegance while carefully avoiding mention of the violence that sustained it. They never mention the girl who proved that some silences are more deadly than any scream. Some say that on quiet Sunday evenings, when the church bells finish chiming and the city settles into southern grace, you can still hear the echo of steel-piercing flesh and the whispered promise that resistance never truly dies. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.